Assalamu alaikum, sabah al-khair, and good morning, Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me distinct pleasure to be moderating this morning's session. My job of introducing the panel has been done for me, so we can go straight into discussing the very complicated issues of this region. I was speaking to our speakers before we began about everything that is facing us only this week, let alone this month or this year in the Arab world. If we think about elections in my home country, Iraq, where this morning we're hearing of a voter turnout of only 44%, which is disappointing. Lebanon, we're still waiting to see what happens with the government there. But of course, with Palestine, that is on the minds of many of us. So as we talk about beyond fear, move us forward from the fear of the unknown and the great uncertainties of the times we have, but towards a future that serves, of course, the people of this region. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Abed Rabbo to begin with us about, when we talk about the future, we have to think about nation states. And the nation state is under strain in this region, and Palestine is a country under occupation. So I want to tell you, how do you think about formulating the future with such immediate dynamics on the ground?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Beirut Institute and all the colleagues who are present here. And, when we speak about the current situation here, let me remind that this is a very long conflict, one of the longest. We are now maybe exceeding 1 century of this conflict. And through different stages, I can say that I maybe represent the 4th or the 5th generation of those who were engaged in such a conflict. Nowadays, it's a very, very difficult moment. In few days, there will be a celebration in Jerusalem where the major power had decided to annex Jerusalem to Israel, and had decided this unilaterally, neglecting the traditional position not only of the international community but of the United States itself. And at the same time, they want to play a role. Still, they claim this as a mediator for starting a peace process or political process in order to achieve peace between the two sides. They gave Jerusalem to Israel, and at the same time, they took one step back by declaring that they don't recognize the two-state solution. They will leave this to the parties to decide, meaning they will leave this to the wolf and the lamb to decide how to divide water between them. In the past years, I would say we had an experience during the time of Prime Minister Salam Fayyad. We had an approach which was criticized by some Palestinians, I would say so many Palestinians, because they were not accustomed to that approach. And I can sum it up by saying the approach was, we start a process of building Palestinian state institutions as if the occupation is leaving tomorrow. And at the same time, we should continue the struggle, the peaceful, popular struggle against the occupation as if the occupation is lasting for so long or forever. Well, combining these two elements together, I think had achieved some successes on the ground and a wide understanding between all over the world, to the extent that this approach was called Fayyadism, after Salam Fayyad's name, who was the prime minister. It was interrupted a few years ago for so many reasons. Some of them are internal, domestic reasons, and some of them are regional and international. But I don't see any other option other than that, especially at this moment where Jerusalem is really endangered. The American administration had given a green light, full green light to Israel to destroy all the progress that we made, and the progress was already limited, but the progress we made towards achieving the solution, which is the two-state solution, had given them green light for more annexation of land, more colonialization of our territories, and a green light also to claim that the solution should be regional first and not Israeli-Palestinian. For that, for all these reasons, the moment is very complicated. But we got accustomed to complicated moments through a long history of a struggle. And in the coming two days, the Palestinian youth will start a demonstration, a peaceful one. And because it started as a peaceful one, Israel did its utmost in order to provoke the people and drag them, push them towards violence in order to justify the Israeli policy of destroying this demonstration. But I believe that our people, the youth, had learned so many lessons better than we did from their fathers and grandfathers. They learned from our mistakes as well, how we can move forward, insist on peaceful way, peaceful methods, but at the same time on our national rights with pride and with insistence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Hossam, Zaki, if I can turn to you, building on that, because when we're looking towards the future, of course, we have these critical days for Jerusalem and for Palestine, but also in terms of the Arab region's construct. The questions are for the Arab League and what you would say to policymakers who are thinking about how we can be thinking and planning for the future when we have these immediate developments here. And where do you see us going forward after this development in Jerusalem?
Good morning, everybody. This is a very difficult question to ask because in the region you have basically 5 sore points. By sore points, I mean obviously Palestine, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, because a lot of people tend to forget Somalia because mainly it's not in the heart of the Arab land, but it is an Arab country. So you have 5 sore points. Those sore points affect a lot what is happening around them. Obviously, Palestine is dominant in all of this because it affects public opinion not only in the vicinity but even beyond and very far beyond. But you also have situations like the one in Syria that is extremely difficult to handle. It is affecting the whole region, and not only the Arab region but beyond as well. Libya also is affecting, Yemen is affecting, and Somalia is affecting. So one angle to look at this is, well, we have those five sore points. What do we do in order to not to make their dangers and problems affect the rest of the region? And how do we go about in handling them? That is one constructive approach, but I'm afraid this is not how people look at them or how people tackle them. So first of all, they are tackled one by one, each one on its own, not as a global, regional problem. And that obviously is not conducive to the right approach. Second, a lot of people tend to forget that in the Arab region, of course, we have 22 countries. Now, 5 of them have serious problems like the ones that we have described, but 17 are going by their daily businesses and the vision for their future in a more or less normal way. You have countries from Morocco to the UAE to a lot of others handling with difficulty sometimes, because we have a scourge of terrorism, we have challenges of development, we have issues of education, health, and beyond. So the agenda is there for each country to deal with. The problem is every country is looking for how to mitigate the effects of the destabilization going on in the region on its own development agenda, on its own stability, its own security. Is this possible? Well, sometimes it is. And obviously, the further you are from those points, the better you can be. When you are close to any of those points, you are to be affected severely. But still, you have countries not only struggling, but with a variety of successes. Take Egypt, for instance, between Libya, Palestine, and the effects of Syria, because it's a major conflict zone, still struggling. It has a terrorism problem within its own borders, but it is struggling and it is making some successes. It's not always easy. So the question that you are posing is an interesting one, in the sense that does it and should it make people think globally in terms of the whole region? That's how we view it in the Arab League, because it's a regional organization. But we need to instill this and make people think, everybody think in the same terms. I'm afraid we're not there yet. This is difficult to achieve. Why? Again, because people tend to focus on this conflict, this conflict or that conflict, and not to have a global vision of how things should be. That is number one. Number two, I'm afraid that if we look in 5 to 10 years term, and even if we're able to, hopefully, we're able to resolve those questions, those sore points, to the best of our ability, we will be having what we call a multi-speed region, meaning that you have already countries that have been able to take off in terms of development, and countries that will be very far behind. And that is a real issue that we will have to deal with in the future. Those countries that I'm talking about will have reconstruction needs, will have rehabilitation needs that will suck a lot of resources, not only regional, but even global. So we need to be careful that we shouldn't have the existing gaps between countries widen even further when we are done with those conflicts. Hopefully one day soon in our lifetime we will see that day coming. So in a nutshell, what I want to say is we have success stories in our regions. Those success stories are based on good vision, good governance, the fact that some societies are trying to shield themselves from conflicts and their effects on them, which is a great thing. We should focus on those other societies, other countries that are less able to affect themselves, and to try to help them, whether by guiding their governance or by giving them some sense of stability, because without stability they cannot really go far in terms of development and in terms of progress. So we need to help those countries regain their stability and be able to go beyond, and not forget in this very complicated process that I'm describing, not forget that we have to deal with those sore points as soon as possible, because the more they continue, the less this region will be able to deal as a region with them. And I'm afraid that if we have them for a long time, for 10 and over 10 years, it will be extremely difficult to describe this region as a whole and to deal with it as a whole and have something called the future of this region. Thank you.
You know, it's interesting, you focus on the issue of stability, which really is a priority for the UAE. And it's interesting, we're having this meeting here in Abu Dhabi because of that significance on stability. And from stability, you can progress and go forward. You raised the issues of having a vision, governance, but also, you know, one of the things we want to talk about in today's session is the international role and international elements that are impacting this region, and especially when we look to the future. So if I can move to you, Mr. Kerim, here in the UAE, there's a real focus also on what technology can give us, what the digital era can give us, and e-governance in terms of tackling some of these issues. So I'd like to take your perspective, especially with your UN background, but also your former role as foreign minister, on this particular aspect.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mina. Well, there is no doubt that the world we live in is a global and digital one. And, but that doesn't mean by default that everything is positive based on these two processes. Technology is certainly dominating, and nowadays we cannot speak about ideologies. That's over, thanks God. Also military camps, as the antagonism in the past between the NATO and the Warsaw Pact existed, ceased to exist. What we have nowadays is a new approach. This new approach based on the digitalized world is how to find ways and means to adjust international institutions to become a driving force of good governance. The UN, as they look like, definitely are not an example of good governance. Sorry to say that, but I think I can say that based on my own experience. I've been president of the General Assembly and candidate for Secretary General, so the institutions, they have to adjust themselves. The UN is 73 years old, and it works in the same way as it did 7 decades ago. Take the example of the Economic and Social Council. The Economic and Social Council, as it works, is not needed at all. We speak today about geography. Yesterday, there was a very effective, very good lecture here by Mr. Parag Khanna. He divided the world into 6 regions, and that's absolutely right. This intercontinental cooperation would be a driving force for technologies, for scientists, for economists, for everything to create jobs. Such intercontinental centers, I can imagine one of them for West Asia to be here in Abu Dhabi, for East Asia, for instance, in Singapore, in South America, Montevideo or Santiago, in Europe, Milan, in the United States and North America, Chicago, or whatever they go for. So with these kind of centers, we can unite the work of governments, civil society, scientists, and business. Without private-public partnership, nothing works today. We have to be aware of that. And this is why the UN has a problem. Not only to reform the Security Council, that's for me a precondition to a way forward, but to reform the whole work of the organization, to involve the private sector, to involve civil society, to involve media, all the factors which dominate the scene today. That's something what we need badly in order to live in a more efficient but also tolerant world. Only economic cooperation, only intercontinental links can be a factor of peace and stability, because we are talking constantly here about peace and stability. We know about the political divisions, we know about different interests in the world, but economy and technology is something which will bring us together. And last but not least, why is it important in this digital era to create such institutions? Economists and other analysts say that by 2030, 70% of the existing jobs will cease to exist. That's a scary perspective for the young generation. We have to create cognitive and creative jobs, and I think this country here, where our host country, is a good example for the model of development where these creative and cognitive jobs can be promoted as the base for economic growth and development. Therefore, I think it could serve as a role model for other countries, other regions, especially for the region here, for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you just the point about economic cooperation, because it assumes that there is mutually beneficial agreements. What we often find in the region is people are concerned that it's not mutually beneficial and that competition often is leading to conflict, especially in certain areas where the conflicts are internal over resources. And that's why people look to the UN or international guarantors of one kind or another to try to help mediate some of these issues. Can the UN still play that role?
Absolutely. The role of mediation is one of the backbones of UN's work and existence. If that fails, that there is no reason for existence of such an organization. Mediation is and has been also when the representative of this region from Qatar was presiding over the United Nations General Assembly, Ambassador Al-Nasser. He made it the annual subject of the UN with a good reason, and we adopted a lot of documents on that one, but the problem is the implementation. They all end up in the shelves, you know, and they are forgotten after 2-3 years. There is no follow-up. That's a big problem.
Andrew, I want to come to you in terms of, we've spoken about the most pressing of conflicts in this region. We've talked about the wider issues for the Arab region and how can we make sure it does have a future. We've spoken about the role of international organizations, but also the role of digitization as we're going forward. I want to come to you about to bring us back down to earth for very pragmatic steps and the key issues that need to be tackled in order to go towards a more prosperous future. Easy
there. Question. Well, first of all, I mean, my answer is informed by, I live in Washington. I deal primarily with the Syria conflict, but I lived 14 years in the Middle East, 90% of which were in Arab countries. So I worked with Arabs. We got to know each other's families, and I came to understand a lot of the challenges that face the region. I think you have an unusual. There's the one challenge of the region it needs to overcome, and that is governance. And the governance in the region is undermined by how many countries have dealt with external threats. Yasser mentioned the issue of the Palestinian issue, which is a long festering issue that needs to be settled justly so that people can go about and live their peaceful lives. The problem is that historically, and here I'm not talking about countries in this part of the Arab world, but around the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the lack of progress on the Palestinian issue was used to justify some of the most horrific repression that we've ever seen. Case in point is Bashar al-Assad's Syria, right? So in the name of a cause, and that is helping Palestinian people, Bashar al-Assad's regime unleashed on its own people a system of control that is now breaking apart and has broken apart very violently. So dealing with external issues, external threats, is a challenge for any society. And it continues to be one for the Arab countries because, in a way, while the Palestinian issue is not resolved, the context has changed. The challenge which is now facing the Arab countries by the advance of Iran inside of some of these broken countries like Syria, Iraq, and so on, is now substantial. At the same time, these Arab countries have deep developmental problems that they need to address. So it's a very tricky situation. The Arab countries need to work together to address these external threats, at the same time as not reducing the liberties of their people to pursue business, the political environment, and so on. And to do that, in order to carry that out, it's going to take, I think, quite a few things. One is, in terms of practicality, it's going to take a vision by leaders in these countries. Not, I don't think, on necessarily a pan-Arab level, but it could be on a more bilateral level, to try and improve the prospects of those who live inside of these countries. The West can work with these countries who want to put forward such a vision. But in order for that to work, in order for the international community to rally around these countries, I think one of the, and this gets us back to the macro level, one of the issues is that there has to be greater contact and coordination, not just between Arab countries, but also between various countries in the region as a whole. And here I'm talking about in the face of the Iranian threat, growing contacts and ties between Arab countries, Israel, and Turkey. And I think this, fostering that going into the future can help on these more micro levels and hopefully help address some of the problems collectively while we all face the threat of Iran.
Okay, but I want to pick up on a couple of things. You said the international community. Does that exist? I mean, this international community that we often turn to, does it still play that role? Because it's very hard to see how we can look towards the international community to help us go forward with so many divisions within them and also as a collective.
No, it's an excellent question. Not as a whole, of course, it's not unified, but I think that there are usually bilateral and multilateral efforts by countries, particularly those who have the resources or the means and the know-how, and they can play a role. But it's true. I mean, the international community collectively responding to a crisis. I think, the Syria conflict is probably the worst case scenario, right? Of the collective international community not responding to the greatest humanitarian disaster, certainly of this century. And so therefore, I think we should look more narrowly at what is possible between countries and then perhaps groups of countries. And maybe this is the good way to start, and we move from there.
And you spoke about the Iranian threat, and the possibility of cooperation between different countries in the region. However, you find Turkey announcing quite clearly that its former foe in Syria is actually a country that it's going to support all the way. So, how do you see that dynamic? How can you actually rely on Turkey if you're looking at the perspective from the Arab world on this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. The Turks have changed their calculations over the course of the war. I think not so much in terms of wanting to keep Bashar al-Assad in power or not. I think that's not really the issue. The issue is they worry about the expansion of the YPG Kurds at their expense, and they regard that organization as an offshoot of the PKK, their sworn enemy. They also resent the fact that the United States built up that force to combat ISIS in the country. And so, despite the fact that those fighters are very capable, they're politically undigestible to the Turks, so to speak. And this has caused them to reevaluate their position. However, it will be interesting to see if Turkey really lurches towards Iran and towards Russia, which is another argument, or if they play some sort of middle road, and if another administration, perhaps this one, is able to bring them back towards what we would traditionally consider the Western or the NATO alliance.
Mm-hmm. David, if I can come to you, as we're talking about, well, one, the role of the U.S. and the alliance of the U.S., but also, you've been coming to the region, writing about the region, interacting with the region for so many years. Where do you see the most critical points to try to change us to move course towards a brighter future and beyond fear?
Mina, if I could just pull my camera back to, I want to say 30,000 feet, but even 500 yards. If I look at this period that we've been living through, the first thing I would say about it is that it's taught us the limits of superpower ability to dictate outcomes. That was the story for the United States in Iraq and Syria, the limits of American military power, diplomatic pressure. And it's, I think, now the lesson for Russia as it seeks to be the dominant power broker in Syria. We'll hear later from our friend Andrei Fedorov about Russia's experience, but my sense is that Russia, like the United States, is discovering how limited its ability to force outcomes has been. So at the same time, this is the period of the decline of superpower ability to dictate. It's also the period of the rise of the regional powers. So we see a more assertive Iran, obviously. We've talked about that now for a day and a half. We see increasingly a more assertive Turkey. We've seen for many decades an assertive Israel. I think we see a newly assertive Saudi Arabia as a regional power. So I think that the question that we should think about in our discussions of moving into the future is how in this world with declining superpower ability to dictate, rising regional power roles, what's the wise path to navigate? What we're seeing, unfortunately, is proxy wars. Syria has largely become a proxy war involving these different regional powers, a carve-up like what we remember from Lebanon in the worst years of the Civil War. Again, to speak frankly, we're seeing internal feuding as within the GCC that is passionately felt here in the Gulf. To many outsiders, it's a head scratcher for us. We're just not sure we understand the cause or consequence of it. So I think that's the counterproductive response to this period of declining superpower, rising regional power. What would be better? And that's the point I want to conclude on. Some hopeful developments that I see that speak to the way the world is working now are first the security discussions that are taking place quietly between unlikely partners. From what little I know, the security discussion between Saudi Arabia and Iraq is now significant. There is a significant exchange of information that makes each country safer. I'd love to see that expanded. We'll see whether in the post-election period in Iraq, its security authorities are able to continue that. Talking with Mr. Jibril and other Libyan friends here, the opportunity for internal discussions that free Libya from this proxy war situation in which it's found itself and get real internal dialogue going, I think are the thing that we should focus on from the outside. How do we encourage that? What would it look like? What are the instruments of it? I just note a final example of difficult, but I think in the long run, very beneficial approaches to problems that have been dealt with by regional powers and superpowers, but ended up being resolved internally, and that's the Kurdish issue in Iraq. The United States kept sending the message to the KRG, to the KDP within the KRG. The U.S. does not support an independent Kurdistan. The referendum that's going to take place, the U.S. regards as contrary to Iraqi and Kurdish interests. That message didn't get through, but in the end, the message was conveyed by the Iraqi authorities. And I think that the KRG now recognizes that there are limits on Kurdish aspirations for the foreseeable future. So in a funny way, that's a problem that was just festering unresolved, that now has on the ground a realistic understanding by all parties. There is now a real red line that people understand they can't cross. And oddly, I'd say that's a model of working problems out in this new period. So my final thought would be, our panel is titled Beyond Fear. What we're actually seeing too often is what I describe using the French phrase, sauve qui peut. Save yourself if you can. You know, rather than beyond fear, moving positively, it's the other. The examples I tried to cite, in line with the way the world is now working, I think are positive, are not sauve qui peut, are not isolating, but begin to bring countries and even regions a little more closely together.
Thank you. David, if I can follow up with you on the U.S. at the moment. You know, people ask questions about where do we see the Trump administration going and its impact on the region, specifically because it's definitely more engaged than the previous administration and seems to have people on board that at least care deeply, whether you agree or disagree with them, care deeply about what happens next and want to influence what happens. So where do you see it with the view from Washington?
In my judgment, the Trump administration is at once more involved and less. It's a strange paradox. This is a president who likes the idea of power, but seems reluctant to commit it in ways that might repeat the difficult experiences of the last 15 years for the U.S. and the Middle East. How many times have we heard him say, we spent $7 trillion and we got nothing, and you're going to have to pay for it, and in general, the opposite of the committed, forward-leaning American role that we're used to. And the one thing I'd say for this audience is it's important for people in the Arab world, around the world, to understand that in these comments, President Trump is reflecting deep, genuine feelings of the American people. That there is a feeling in the United States that our resources, our people, were used to no particular good purpose in this long period. And so there's a deep frustration and a reluctance to commit new power. You know, we talk about, couldn't the U.S. get involved in Libya and helping broker a settlement there? I'm all for it. I like the idea of intervening to help people solve problems. I'm just telling you, in the United States and in the United States Congress, there's tremendous resistance. So this is a period where the president talks about being a strong, assertive leader, but there's an awful lot in our subterranean political culture that says, stay away.
Thank you. Mr. Zaki, if I can turn to you, there's a lot to be said in this region about the visions that we have for the region. So again, coming from the UAE, there's a strong vision about how can we progressive, if we're making plans for space missions, or if we're thinking about Arab hope makers or others, that's trying to go in one direction. And then we have a different vision that is mixed with whether it's extremism, whether there's a belief of the rejection of the other and otherwise. So how, again, can we influence developments on the ground based on these varying visions for the region? How do we make sure that it isn't dark forces that want to keep us in these cycles of violence, which of course are backed up by economies that benefit from it, by weapons sales that are benefiting from it? That's the reality of what we're facing. And the other side that actually wants to be visionary and take us to a place of not only stability, but growth.
Yes, thank you. Well, we can all daydream about progress, but who's going to be able to achieve it in this region under these circumstances? It's very difficult. Difficult for a variety of reasons. I was not here yesterday, but I guess you spoke many speakers spoke a lot about the interference in the internal affairs of states. You have Iran, you have Turkey, you have Israel, you have many of those non-Arab countries interfering in Arab affairs without any checks. That is something that causes interruption in any process. You have those dark forces that you call them. Obviously, those are the product of locally but also internationally aided groups that are here and that are working, functioning, reading, multiplying, and viciously opposed to any talk about progress, about future, about how to see societies advance, how to see women advance, and so on. So you need to be very firm. You need to have a vision. When we speak about vision, you need to have that. You need to have a vision of where do you want to see your society? Is it a society that would be more on the side of those dark forces? Or is it a society that should be free of those dark forces? When we say dark forces, by the way, and for someone from the region like you and for all those who belong to our region, it is not only the organizational capabilities or the fact that they resort to violence through arms and so on, but it is the minds. It is in the minds of those people. So whether or not you have this type of educational systems that produce this type of dark-leaning intelligentsia or dark-leaning public opinion, that is an option that countries make. You speak about the UAE, and obviously we all know that the UAE has taken a decision in that matter. So they have chosen that they do not want their society to be like that, and they based everything on this vision. A very correct vision from my side. What I mean to say is, we need to be very careful when we speak about vision. Sometimes it is possible to achieve. Sometimes the challenges are too big to handle for one society to handle. It has to do with the political internal scene in any country. It has to do with the developmental level of that society. And it has to do with the regional and international interference in the affairs of the region and of each society individually.
Okay, thank you. So we only have 5 minutes before I have to close this session, which I'm sure we could pick up many other elements too. So to close, I want to go to each of you, and this is a tough ask, but bear with me. If there was one development or one particular issue that the region should focus on to take us to a brighter future and beyond fear, what would it be? So if I can start with you, Mr. Kerim.
Syria. That's our tragedy. It's not only a tragedy of Syria, it's a tragedy of the so-called international community, which you could not define. I cannot define it as well. Everybody is in deadlock there. The United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey, all the parties involved. The way out for Syria, the outcome in Syria, will determine a lot of processes in this world.
Thank you.
What he said.
Thank you.
Well, I really agree that Syria is a very tragic moment in our history, in the history of this region. And I would say that we Palestinians even have a share in every tragedy here or there. Although we have 500,000 Palestinians were there and were in Yarmouk refugee camp, we don't know now what is the destiny of 90% of these people. Where are they? And this became a part of the Palestinian tragedy. So we are, with the Syrians, really feel that if this plight is not forced to an end, the whole region will be affected, not only in the long run, but look at the incidents of the past weeks. On the short run, it will explode in the face of everybody in this region. Thank you.
Thank you.
I beg to differ. I tell you something. When you have a patient in the ICU with a severe situation that doctors call multi-organ failure. Multi-organ failure is a very serious situation where you have the major organs of the body failing. The major organs being brain, heart, liver, and kidney. If you have any of those failing, that is catastrophic. If you have all of them failing, that is lethal. I would say the Palestinian problem is the heart failure. If we can do anything to revive those other organs and the heart fails, the patient still dies. That's what I believe. If you can deal with the kidney, you can deal with the liver, you can even deal with the brain. I'm not a doctor, but no, but that is a very without the heart you cannot deal with the brain. So it's a very complicated situation. This is what we live actually now. So we have to tackle it as a multi-organ failure, and we have to deal with all of them simultaneously if possible. But obviously my inclination would be Palestine, because it has been and it will remain at the heart of most of the problems that we see. Thank you.
I'm going to agree with the two of my colleagues that Syria is the central challenge. And just note that as Syria was a model of how things have come apart in this period, it could be, don't want to sound naive here, but it could be a model of how things come back together. And to describe that model the Syria that will work is one that is strong at the core and loose at the edges. It needs to be strong enough to maintain the integrity of its territory. It has encroachment from the north, from Turkey. It has encroachment really on all sides. So it needs a strong central government that can prevent that. But it needs to have a loose, decentralized, quasi-federalist character so that all the different minorities that characterize Syria, this Sunni majority but diverse country, feel that they have a stake. And finally, it's a model of how superpowers, Russia, the United States, must, in this period, work with regional powers to get any kind of settlement. So I think that's the problem, and if it could be solved, it's the model for dealing with so many other things.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for a great discussion on this panel. I appreciate it. I will say, just from Ambassador Zaki's remarks, you know, it's true we may be having multiple organ failure, but we remain one body. And I think for the vast majority of Arabs and those who are within the Arab world, where we don't say Arabs just as Arabs in terms of ethnicity, but of the Arab culture who speak the Arab tongue and call this region their home, we are one body, and we must make sure to address those failures. So thank you all. Please thank my panel.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you, sirs and excellencies.